I'm Kara O'Donnell, and this is County Board Wrap-Up, our monthly deep dive into the actions taken by the Arlington County Board at its monthly meeting, as well as hot topics around our community. Today we're joined by County Board Chair Katie Crystal and Board Member Eric Gutshaw. Katie and Eric, thank you both for joining us today. Well, let's start off. We have been talking about the budget for the last couple of months now here on Board Rep, but we have now passed the budget. Let's talk about what actually transpired here.
Absolutely. So after 11 work sessions, many opportunities to have conversations with members of the community, a public hearing on the tax rate, a public hearing on the budget itself, and countless conversations among board members, we took an action last Saturday to pass our fiscal 19 budget. It wasn't an easy year. As you and others know, our projected needs are growing faster than our assessed property values. That opened up a gap this year, and it's opening up a bigger gap in the years to come. So I think while we were all cognizant this year of trying to balance the fiscal 19 budget, we were also doing so in mind of recognizing we're setting a lot of precedents here for how we have these difficult conversations and whether we will batten the hatches and do what we can to prepare for those long-term trends now or kick the can down the road. We tried to opt for the former this year.
And just kind of prepare things for later on.
Absolutely.
Now, the manager did propose a budget for all of you back in February, I believe. Did you pass that as is, or were there some changes along the way?
We did make some changes along the way. We did identify, rather, the manager helped identify a small pool of what are sometimes described as one-time money. It's different, of course, than ongoing money, and so you want to do different things with it. You don't, for example, want to fund salaries or add new FTE with one-time money. But it does mean that we can take on some priorities for the purposes of projects in fiscal 19. The best example of that, I think, and I know this is a priority for Eric as well as for me, is we restored some of the funding that the manager had proposed to cut to the Lee Highway Planning Study. That's a one-time project, but it is a project that will have reverberations for generations truly into the future. And we wanted to make sure there was sufficient funds to pay for a really robust planning study that could not only chart out what we envision for the corridor, but give us running room to explore some really innovative ideas about the future of Lee Highway and not feel constrained. So that's a place where we put some additional funding.
Now, I know we also had the issue of needing to generate some new funds, Metro, some additional funds for schools. Where did those things come from, and how did we make way for that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Well, the piece on schools is an important one, and I think really emblematic of what I was just alluding to. We're in the point where there's no more money to be found, right? Everything is hard choices and trade-offs. We were able to identify about $2.5 million additional in money, one-time money, for public schools by shaving back the planned renovation budget for the county office building. The Ellen Bosman actually recently dedicated county office building. The county received some pots of funds as a result of re-signing the lease for the next some years of this building. Some of that money was rent rebates, basically rent breaks for signing a long-term lease. That's money that had been programmed for the renovations to this building, to these workspaces, but also could go to the general fund or could go to schools. So we shaved that budget back by $2.5 million with the savings from it going to schools instead.
Okay. And how about for Metro? We did get a dedicated funding source for Metro, but that's an ongoing issue, as I think it always will be.
Absolutely. And I will say we have good news and bad news out of the General Assembly. The good news, in fact, the great news, is that we have a watershed moment of a dedicated funding source for Metro that has now been matched by the district in Maryland. It will be critical in Metro being able to get to and realize and sustain a state of good repair, which is essential. That's the good news. The bad news is where the money comes from. Unfortunately, with part of a regional coalition, we persuaded the governor and persuaded the state Senate that some modest tax increases on sources such as those visiting hotel stays in Northern Virginia should go to dedicated Metro funding. The partisan majority in the House of Delegates did not accept that, and instead where this dedicated funding will be coming from is localities like Arlington will be on the hook to pay in about $8 million more on top of the $75 million we already pay from Arlington County, and major cuts to our regional funding for road and transportation projects. impacts. So we'll be seeing the impacts of that through opportunities foregone or delayed, and we'll see more of it during our capital improvement planning process, which kicks off next month.
We also had a few items that were on the list to be reduced significantly that you actually put back into play after hearing a lot of those public comments. What are some of those?
Well, I think it would be remiss if we didn't mention the shredder, right? We spent tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was, and it really shows how the process can work. It's really important that we hear from the community and what matters to them. And frankly, we heard from quite a few folks that the service offered by the county, while I don't think any of us on the board really felt this was an essential core government function, it was a piece of equipment that we already owned. And so to just keep it going for the life of that equipment for a few more years, hopefully, we restored that money, a small amount of money to the budget because we heard from folks that it was important. Similarly, on something that is sort of larger scale, we heard from a lot of folks from Arlington independent media. There was some rather significant cuts that were proposed. And again, this is a transitional kind of budget, right? We are moving into an era of more constraints, as Ms. Crystal just very adequately just described. And so I think that's how we looked at the issue with Arlington Independent Media, is that there are some structural changes that are happening that the organization will need to adapt to, but we didn't ultimately feel it was appropriate to sort of leave them in a lurch, if you will. So we are going to continue to work with them and come up with a transition plan where they will be sustainable on into the future. It's an invaluable service. They are best community independent media in 10 years running, recognized nationally, so we wanted to do that. There's was also, we restored money for planning for Lee Highway. That is the Lee Highway corridor, the civic associations in the community, the business community along the corridor there have spent years in the making getting ready for a major planning initiative there. And we on the board wanted to make sure that was going to move forward with the full depth and breadth of the scope that was originally envisioned. And so we were able to restore most, not all, but most of the money for that, and we're looking forward to that effort.
And as we move forward, I think the word of the day for the next few years, in fact, is going to be austerity in terms of our budgets, that this is going to be the way we need to approach things for a little while.
I think to some extent that's right, although one of the things I mentioned in my final comments as we pass the budget is I wouldn't actually consider this budget a conservative or austere one. I would describe it, I think, as sustainably progressive.
Okay.
We are continuing to invest in the core values in Arlington County. We're continuing to invest in the people that make this one of the best educated, best policed, and best supported counties in America. There are raises for our public safety. There are significant raises for our teachers. There are continued investments in some of the challenges that face our community, whether it's child care affordability or the opioid crisis or mental health needs. I think it's really important for us to emphasize we're not backing off of our core commitments, but for a long time we have measured the strength of those commitments in terms of dollars invested, and I think it's important that we enter an era where we start measuring our commitments in terms of outcomes achieved. And that really is going to be the watchword for the coming years. How do we maintain what we value in Arlington County and get smart about measuring it and making sure we're achieving it, and not just assuming that that big dollars equal the values we've come to see.
Right, right.